Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Sabrina Bronlick. I am the Program Associate with the Whale and Dolphin Conservation. I'm going to be the moderator for today's event. So while we're getting started and pretty much here, we just want to wait for a few more people to join. While we're waiting, we love for this to be interactive. So drop in the comments or in the chat where you're watching from. We really do love the fact that Orca Month has gone virtually still. So we are able to reach people from pretty much all over the United States and outside of it as well. So drop where you're watching from. In addition, we will have time for some question and answers at the end. So if you have a question that you are burning to ask, you can always add it into the question and answer feature down at the bottom, I believe. And we will make sure it gets to the panelists as well. Now, speaking of our panelists, let me introduce you to them. So first up, we have Shannon Rake. Shannon oversees the Hope Spot program, working with Mission Blue's Hope Spot champions and partners in over 130 Hope Spots. She also works directly with the Hope Spots Scientific Council. She's inspired by Dr. Sylvia Earle and the work of our Hope Spot champions and partners who are working on a variety of actions, pushing for ocean conservation and protection in each Hope Spot. Next up, we have Colleen Weiler. Colleen is the Jessica Ricos Fellow for Orca Conservation with Whale and Dolphin Conservation. WDC is an international nonprofit dedicated to the protection of whales and dolphins. Our mission is to amaze people with the wonder of whales and dolphins and inspire global action to protect them. Colleen's role, though, focuses on identifying effective conservation strategies for at-risk orca populations, especially the endangered southern resident orcas off the west coast of the US and Canada. She focuses on campaigns, outreach, and advocacy. And lastly, we have Dr. Erin Meyer. Now, Dr. Erin is the Director of Conservation Programs and Partnerships at the Seattle Aquarium, where she oversees a diverse portfolio of projects in the US and Coral Triangle. The Seattle Aquarium's mission is to inspire conservation of our marine environment. They take action through animal care and rehabilitation, research and field conservation, policy and advocacy, and social change programs. And their work centers around three conservation priorities: climate resiliency, sustainable seas, and clean waters. So we are going to just kick things right off with a video that tells us a bit more about the Hope Spots, and then Shannon will get to dive into it a bit further.
What keeps the ocean perpetual? It's taken more than 4 billion years for the ocean to arrive at the state that we enjoy today. It's taken us about 4.5 decades to significantly unravel those systems that make Earth habitable for us and the rest of life on Earth as we know it. The next 10 years will really determine the outcome of the next 10,000 years. Mission Blue was founded in 2009 to develop a network of Hope Spots, protected areas in critically vulnerable parts of the ocean. There are now over 140 Hope Spots globally, and more to come. It's really about developing a network of people who are inspired to make a difference through their actions, getting people around the world to come together, to use their knowledge, to use their desire to do something positive, and to inspire others to do the same. What can they do to turn things from this into a time of recovery? That is the goal. That's what will make the living ocean perpetual.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for playing that. That is obviously the amazing Dr. Sylvia Earle, otherwise known as Her Deepness. And so happy to be here with you guys today, celebrating Orca Month. Wow, that's super exciting. And excited to talk to you a little bit about the Salish Sea Hope Spot that we just launched in February of this year. So just a little bit of background. Mission Blue was founded in 2009 after Sylvia gave her amazing TED Talk and subsequently won the TED Prize. If you haven't checked it out, you can check out her TED Talk on YouTube. I highly recommend it. And her TED wish was to ignite public support for a global network of marine protected areas called Hope Spots. And that together, these areas all over the world would be large enough to save and restore the ocean. So here we are, 2021, almost 12 years later, with over 140 Hope Spots supported by communities who are working on a variety of actions to protect their part of the ocean. So what is a Hope Spot, you might ask? Well, Hope Spots are places that have gone through a nomination process that have been evaluated by our scientific council and are identified as critical to the health of the ocean. They are places that have a special abundance or diversity of species, have populations of rare, threatened, or endemic species, a site with potential to reverse damage from negative human impacts, the presences of natural processes such as major migration corridors, spawning, breeding, feeding grounds. And all of our Hope Spots are championed by local conservationists whom we support with communications, expeditions, scientific advisory, and policy. All of our Hope Spots are on a unique journey based on their location, their size, the community, the government engagement, and they all fall on what I like to call a spectrum. So everything from areas that don't have any current protections, but are in need of protection, to all those that are fully highly protected. And the ones being at the beginning of the spectrum might be working on community engagement, getting their local community to understand what is there and why is it important to protect. And others might be somewhere in the middle where they're working on restoration efforts for corals or mangroves or fish stocks. And then there's others that might be fully highly protected. But as we know, unfortunately, as administrations change, so can protections. So our goals are to either expand those areas to help get more protection, to help reach 30% by 2030, which is all part of the 30 by 30 campaign, which I think Aaron or somebody might talk a little bit more later in this webinar. And just to make sure that those areas are fully highly protected. So there's different levels of protection within NPAs. And so we're trying to just push that needle forward in whatever capacity we can in each Hope Spot, depending on where they're at in their unique journey. And today's focus, obviously, is celebrating Orca Month and the southern resident orcas, who are the icons of the Salish Sea. And the Salish Sea was launched as a Hope Spot in February of this year. It's championed by Casey McLean, Executive Director of SR3, Sea Life Response, Rehab, and Research. And they recently opened a marine mammal hospital in Des Moines, Washington. And the Salish Sea Hope Spot is supported by an amazing group of partners that include two of my wonderful co-panelists today, Colleen with WDC and Aaron with the Seattle Aquarium, as well as our partners from MCI, Pacific Mammal Research, Oceanwise, SeaSmart, Earth Law Center, Co-Extinction, PNW Protectors, and United and Free. The goals of our Salish Sea Hope Spot are to raise awareness about the threats to the Salish Sea, increase research, strengthen working relationships with tribal entities and First Nations, unite the many NGOs working to protect the Salish Sea, increase public action for support of legislation that impacts the Salish Sea and its inhabitants, and to create an understanding amongst the public for the Salish Sea and how its protection is critical for human health. So I hope you stick with us for the remainder of the webinar. And I have a special video from Dr. Sylvia Earle for all of you that we're gonna play at the end of the webinar. So stay tuned for that. And I'm now going to pass the microphone to my co-panelist, Dr. Erin Meyer with the Seattle Aquarium, and she's gonna talk and tell us about the Salish Sea ecosystem and why it is so special. Erin?
Thanks, Shannon, and welcome everyone. Thanks to all those out there who are watching us live today. So let me tell you a little bit about the Salish Sea. So the Salish Sea is an incredibly unique inland sea and is biologically and socioculturally rich. Geographically, the Salish Sea is located in the temperate climate of the Pacific Northwest in North America, crossing international boundaries from Washington in the United States north into British Columbia, Canada, and it intersects across numerous tribal and First Nation territories along the way. It has complex underwater topography, which was carved out by retreating glaciers 16 to 19,000 years ago. And while today it's mostly shallow water, the average depth is actually 430 feet with a maximum depth of nearly half a mile. So it gets very deep in parts of the sea, and apologies for those who would like to see those in meters and kilometers. The Salish Sea is also surrounded by multiple mountain ranges with over 150 rivers draining into it off of those mountains. The Salish Sea is a complex water body where ocean water and freshwater mix and flow out with the tides. Now, this complex geography and geology laid the foundation for the Salish Sea to be one of the most diverse inland seas on Earth. It's home to over 3,500 documented species of mammals, birds, fishes, and macroinvertebrates, and the largest species of barnacles, chitons, octopuses, and sea stars in the world call these waters home. Not to mention, as Shannon did mention, the endangered southern resident orcas, as well as several threatened and endangered populations of salmon, rockfishes, and abalone. And the Salish Sea supports a wide diversity of ecosystems, such as estuaries where salt and freshwater mingle, complex rocky intertidal habitats where animals experience extreme environments due to the tides, rocky reefs and majestic kelp forests of kelp that grow up to 60 feet tall, or roughly the height of a 4-story building, and spectacular eelgrass meadows, which not only provide vital habitat and refuge for hundreds of species, from salmon to Dungeness crabs, but they're also the powerhouse of climate resilience and carbon sequestration. Now, this rich biodiversity and ecosystems of the Salish Sea also support climate resilient communities, active fisheries, and growing tourism economy here in the Pacific Northwest. And the Salish Sea also brings us physical and mental health as we live, work, and play along the shores and on and underwater. And as I mentioned, the Salish Sea is also home to the Coast Salish and Waukeshan peoples who have stewarded these waters and the surrounding lands since time immemorial, continue to do so today, and will for every generation to come. And the cultures of the tribes and First Peoples of the Salish Sea are interwoven into the fabric of the Pacific Northwest. But today, big cities, small towns, and rural lands pepper the coastline, and the region is currently home to almost 9 million people and growing. Now, while the biodiversity of the Salish Sea has remained fairly constant, the ecosystems within it are experiencing multiple stressors from climate change, ocean acidification, habitat loss, overfishing, pollution, and many other sources. But a growing community of partners are working together to develop solutions, challenge the people of our region, and push for a future in which the Salish Sea and all who inhabit the waters and coastlines thrive. And while we couldn't possibly talk about the Salish Sea without talking a bit more about the orcas, and not just because it's Orca Action Month. So orcas have lived together here in the Salish Sea with the Coast Salish and Waukeshan peoples for thousands of years, including the northern and southern residents who feed almost exclusively on Chinook or king salmon, as well as the transients or Biggs orcas who feed on other marine mammals like seals. And as one of the most iconic animals in the Salish Sea, orcas are truly our local ambassadors. And with that, I'm going to pass the virtual mic on to Colleen, who's going to share a bit more about one of the most well-known populations of orcas, the endangered southern residents.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for that wonderful history of the Salish Sea. It's always amazing to hear about how it formed, because that is something I always forget, and how deep it is in some places. I didn't know that it was up to a half-mile deep in some places, so that's pretty amazing. And I am going to jump into the reason why we got everyone together today to talk about the Hope Spot and the Salish Sea, and those orcas as the fantastic ambassadors for both. and talk about the southern resident population, which is a unique community of orcas that calls the Salish Sea home, that is their core summer habitat, but really are true Pacific Northwest orcas. So kind of unite the whole region in Orca Action Month. And to talk about how the southern residents are doing today in Orca Action Month. So currently, there are 75 southern resident orcas in the wilds, which is well below the level of 89 individuals in the population when they were listed under the Endangered Species Act in 2005, as well below their historical estimates of around 200 whales. They recently reached a 40-year low with just 73 orcas in 2019, which was the smallest the population has been since the Center for Whale Research began to count the orcas in the official orca census in 1976. But there is hope for the population, with 5 new calves born since December of 2018, including 3 in J-pod and 2 in L-pod, who seem to be doing well and healthy. The primary threats to these whales are issues that reflect the health and the status of the entire Salish Sea, a lack of their primary prey, salmon, which is another icon of the Pacific Northwest, very high levels of contaminants, and noise and disturbance. These threats can compound their impacts on the whales, and these expectant mothers are especially affected as they try to carry healthy pregnancies to term. And approximately 69% of pregnancies detected in recent years have not resulted in a healthy living calf. So these 5 new babies are especially precious and meaningful for the community. The good news, another aspect of hope, is that these whales are still getting pregnant, and health assessment research that is done by SR3, as Shannon mentioned, and their partners show that there are pregnant females. So the whales are doing their part to survive and to grow their community. And it's up to us to do our part to ensure that these expectant moms and their new calves have a safe and healthy home. And that includes protecting their core home, the Salish Sea. And among these new calves is J57, or Phoenix, a male who was born to Tahlequah in September of 2020. Many may remember Tahlequah for her heartbreaking story in the summer of 2018, when she gave birth to a calf that lived for just 30 minutes and then carried the body of that calf with her for 17 days around the Salish Sea. Her grief and her journey touched hearts around the world and brought the story of the southern residents to the spotlight in a way that perhaps nothing that we could do ever could. It really shared the struggle of these orcas around the world. And while we are so glad that Tahlequah's story continues in a more positive manner with this healthy new calf, we hope that our shared story with them is also this encouraging, and that we can make progress towards saving her whole family. So to survive, these whales not only need more food, cleaner waters, and a quieter home, but a collection of human advocates and groups who are speaking up for them in the decision-making process that affects them and their home. And that starts with us. So I want to give a special shout out to our friends at SR3, who are the local champions of the Mission Blue Hope Spot. And as Shannon mentioned, they are busy right now with their brand new marine mammal hospital and responding to stranded marine mammals in this busy summer season. So they couldn't be here today, but we are grateful for them for leading this effort and for allowing us to support them and the southern resident orcas in this work. And like the orcas, and thank you, Shannon, for going through the whole list, we have an amazing community of groups that are working together to protect the Salish Sea. And so I want to recognize everybody who is part of this effort that SR3 and Mission Blue have helped bring together to help support the Hope Spot. And on that, we are now, I think, going to jump to some Q&A. And see if we got any questions coming in. So just a brief overview of Hope Spots and Mission Blue and the Salish Sea, the home of the orcas, and then the orcas themselves. So if folks have questions, now's the time to let us know. I'll get started with one. And Shannon, this one's for you. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Hope Spots are nominated and selected?
Absolutely, yeah. So The Hope Spots program has evolved over the 12 years that Mission Blue has been in existence. Initially, it wasn't open to the public for nominations for the first 6 years or so. And then in 2016, we decided to open it up to the public to really, gain momentum on Hope Spots all over the globe and really let people, tell us, areas that they think need awareness and need protection. So now the way it works is there's a nomination process. There's a nomination form, which is has a list of a lot of scientific criteria. What's the biodiversity there? What are the ecological values? A lot of that kind of good stuff. And I would say that while it is open to the public, if there's somebody, our champions kind of range as far as what they do. A lot of them are scientists. A lot of them run NGOs or work for NGOs as part of their full-time work. Some of them are ecotourism operators, dive operators, etc. And then some are citizens that are just really passionate and live in an area and want to help. And so for those that are not, don't have the scientific background, we just ask that they partner with a scientific organization that's local to their area, that's doing work in their area. And then that way they can answer all the questions, all the scientific questions in the nomination form that our council requires and is part of the requirements to go through the process. So yes, anybody can nominate. We actually have a young girl, 14 years old, who's nominating a Hope Spot right now, obviously with her mother and then with a scientific institution. So that's kind of cool and fun. And yeah, so technically it is open to everybody, and then there's just ways to make that work with connecting kind of the general public with scientific institutions. And then the nomination process is kind of the start to a long ongoing process, everlasting relationship with us, and working on conservation and protection in that area. So the nomination process is kind of the beginning, and then once it gets designated by our council, assuming that it does, then it's forever and beyond a long-term relationship working towards protection and conservation, because we know, unfortunately, in the conservation field that conservation protection can take time. So we a lot of our Hope Spot partners are in it for the long haul, are in it for decades and to come, and that's what we're excited about. And then we support them on their journey, support them in a variety of ways. But ultimately, what I say is we give them a seat at the table. So a lot of times it's, smaller NGOs or organizations or scientific institutions that, governments may not want to listen to or may not give the time to. And then we can shine that international spotlight, obviously, with Mission Blue's following and Dr. Sylvia Earle's life work, to kind of give them a seat at the table and allow people to listen.
Mixing it up a little bit, Erin, I know you talked a lot about the Salish Sea. So can you kind of explain the name of Salish Sea?
Oh my goodness. So yes. So the origin story of that name, it's actually not a name that's been sitting on maps, at least for that long of a period of time. It's something that was more formalized actually in the 1980s as as scientists really started looking at, of course, we've known for a really long time that the bodies of water from Washington up into British Columbia that now make up what we call the Salish Sea, at least on maps, is connected. And none of those river systems and that water body has been connected since the Salish Sea was created by glaciers many, many, many years ago. But as we started thinking more about the threats facing the Salish Sea, and as I remember as some threats were emerging in the 80s, that it became really important to be able to, in government circles and in conservation circles, to be able to really codify that this is one body of water that's connected, and something that happens up in British Columbia or something that's happening down here in Washington waters affects the body of water in the other place and vice versa. And being able to talk about these waters as connected is something that motivated the need for a internationally and globally recognized name for this body of water, for this inland sea. And so the name actually came, and I'm not gonna remember the exact year that it came out. I want to say it was formal in 1989 by Bert Weber, actually up at the Western Washington University, was the main proponent of the name. And it went through rounds and rounds of conversations with community members and First Nations, both here in Washington and in British Columbia, to come around and decide on what the name would be for this body of water. And it comes from, my understanding is that it finds its home from the fact that the first peoples of this area around the bodies of water are the Coast Salish peoples, roughly translating from multiple language into English as Salish. And that's what inspired the name Salish Sea. And it's been really important and hard work over the last 30, 40, almost 40 years, I guess now, or 30 something years, to try and raise awareness about the name and make sure people that it doesn't just live on a map, that it's a name that is recognized by people, and that we work to help people understand how connected the waters are and the people are across the whole region.
And so going further into the Salish Sea, why is it considered at risk? Erin, you might be able the best one to answer that.
So I can jump in on that, and then Colleen definitely jump in anytime as well. So there, as I mentioned when I was kind of giving the overview of the Salish Sea, it's now home to over almost 9 million people. So there are a lot of people, and when there are a lot of people, there's a lot of stress on the environment. So some of that comes from land-based sources of pollution and coastal development. And then of course, the thing we're experiencing right now today in Seattle, climate change, as we're cranking up to 110 later today in Seattle, we're definitely experiencing global warming and seeing how that impacts our coastal ecosystems and our marine ecosystems like the Salish Sea. So there are some major impacts with increasing temperatures, with major fluctuations in pH, causing something we're now calling ocean acidification, among other things. And all of these diverse stressors are coming together to enable things like disease outbreaks that we wouldn't have otherwise seen. And all of these stresses on our really incredibly diverse ecosystem here, we're starting to see them take shape in things like sea star wasting, and in seeing habitats like kelp forest ecosystems disappear in parts of the Salish Sea. So we together with the multitude of partners that Shannon and Colleen mentioned are working really hard to think about how we bring some of these ecosystems back. How do we protect the ecosystems that are still here? Because in order for the Salish Sea to continue to be a place of climate resilience, we need to make sure that we're protecting those ecosystems we still have, and finding and investing in opportunities to restore those that have been impacted by anything from coastal development to coastal pollution to things related to climate change as well.
And adding to that too, and why the Southern residents are such a good ambassador species for this effort, because the impacts on them are very visible. They're very visible. Marine mammals in general are a very visible species for what's happening under the water that we might not be aware of or might not become aware of in time to take action for it. But for the orcas, it's pretty evident, they have not been in the Salish Sea at this point, I think, for 11 weeks. And this is a time period where they would normally be seen every day around San Juan Island. And they have not been in the area since April. And again, this is their core home. This is their summer habitat where they used to spend significant amounts of time here in the summer feeding on salmon. And they just, especially in the last few years, have not been here as they have been in the past. And so that's a pretty clear sign that something is going on that we need to pay attention to and that we need to take action on. before we run out of time. Aaron mentioned some of the development that's been happening in this area. And another part of that is the development happens so quickly, like within the last few decades, that we don't have a lot of systems and structures in place to deal with the environmental impacts of that. So we're losing salmon, we're losing kelp forests and nearshore habitat a lot faster than we can restore it. And so making some of those policy changes so that we can reverse that decline and be more prepared going into the future to help protect and preserve the Salish Sea now.
You made an interesting point, Colleen, in saying that the southern residents actually haven't been to the Salish Sea since about April, you said. So that kind of leads to another common question that I know I've definitely wondered too. So where do they go when they're not in the Salish Sea?
Well, I mentioned a little bit earlier that they are truly Pacific Northwest orcas, which is something I live in Oregon, so I like to reiterate that a lot because a lot of folks in Oregon don't realize or don't fully understand that the whales come down off our coast too, and that Oregon has a very important role to play, not only in speaking up to protect the Salish Sea as an important Pacific Northwest ecosystem, but also the whales, because they go as far south as Monterey Bay, California. They're usually off the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington in the winter and early spring. And it seems like the last couple years when they have not been in the Salish Sea in the summer, they have been just offshore of Vancouver Island. But I believe at the moment, nobody really knows where they are, which is the big question mark of we don't know where they're going at the moment. Hopefully wherever they are going, they are finding food, because they will go where there is food available or looking for food. But their patterns are changing. So as I mentioned, they're typically in the Salish Sea in the summer, and then in the coastal waters in the winter and in the early spring. And that pattern has really been changing in the last few years. And that's directly linked to a lack of available food in the Salish Sea.
It makes sense, because where the food is where the whales will go, as I'm sure applicable to many, many other species, both in the water and on land as well. So what exactly do the southern residents eat, and how is I know you kind of touched a little bit about the food source, and especially in the Pacific Northwest, but can you talk about it a little bit more?
Sure. And again, salmon are the primary part of their diet and are another really iconic and important species in the Salish Sea and in the Pacific Northwest. And a new study just came out earlier this year that shed a lot of light on what the whales are eating year round. Going back to the Salish Sea, because they used to be around so much in the summer, there was a lot of information available about what they were eating in the summer, because they were here, scientists were able to access them pretty easily and collect fecal samples and prey samples and figure out that they were mostly eating Chinook salmon in the late spring and in the early summer, and diversified a little bit more with coho and chum salmon in the fall when they go a little farther south into Puget Sound. So mostly salmon, kind of different types at different times, but Chinook salmon, which is the biggest and fattiest of all the salmon species, is their preferred food year round. And even when they're in coastal waters, this new information was able to add a lot of detail on what they're eating off the coasts of Oregon and Washington, California. And Chinook salmon is still the preferred food. It's about half of what they're eating, even in coastal waters. So they're going after that big fatty salmon all the time, and following the different runs of salmon that are returning to major rivers along the West Coast at different times of the year. So in the spring, it would be Fraser River salmon coming back to the Vancouver, Canada area and coming through the Salish Sea. Different Puget Sound water systems in the summer and in the fall, and then Columbia Basin, Klamath River, and Sacramento Central Valley River in the wintertime. So lots of salmon, lots of Chinook, and without enough Chinook, they're traveling a lot farther and ranging a lot wider to try and find that available Chinook salmon.
And just adding one other note around that, we've talked a lot about now, Colleen mentioned a lot about how our salmon populations in the Pacific Northwest have been going down, but not only are the numbers far lower than they used to be, Chinook salmon don't get as big as they used to either. So they're spending the same amount of energy to catch smaller fish, as well as the fact that our waters here in Southern resident orca territory are also experiencing high levels of pollution. And so the salmon that they are eating here in the Washington waters are actually more, they have more, a higher load of pollution in their tissues than the salmon do that are up off of British Columbia. So there's just yet another, as I mentioned earlier, the multiple stressors that these animals are facing. So having to travel farther to find more and hopefully fatter fish elsewhere.
And just let me add one more thing on that is I'm in California, so we're kind of all scattered. All of us panelists were scattered throughout the West Coast here, but you know, we're under a drought. California's in a drought, and so our rivers are extremely low. Our water reservoirs are extremely low, and so when our rivers aren't functioning, you know, that's a direct result of climate change, global warming, and climate change. And when the rivers don't have enough water, that affects obviously the salmon runs and the salmon spawning, and that affects population numbers. So again, there's so many different things that are coming together, you know, to kind of threaten the food source here for the orcas, because that's what we're talking about. And so it's unfortunate, but there's a lot happening, a lot of threats happening. And then in addition to that, Erin, you pointed out, you talked about ocean acidification. And I think a lot of people may not know that, how that's affecting shellfish. And maybe you could talk about that. I know we have the Bodega Bay Marine Lab out here, and they have a white abalone nursery that they raise abalones all the way from like little teeny larvae pinheads all the way up. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how ocean acidification affects shellfish and their development or lack thereof.
Sure. Yeah. So the short answer is it makes it hard for them to grow a shell. So when you have waters that are becoming less basic and moving toward being acidic, the water, it's actually difficult for animals to get the calcium out of the water to create shells. There are a couple, I could get into the chemical details, but that's the easiest way to talk about it, particularly when animals are trying to form their first initial shell, their first shell. It's very, very difficult to get the calcium out of the water that they need when the pH is lower. And so to your point, Shannon, around the shellfish community, you know, our local aquaculture firms here in Washington have been struggling with this for a long time. And with that struggle came attention to the issue of ocean acidification, and the Washington's Blue Ribbon Panel on Ocean Acidification that really looked at what are the far-reaching effects of ocean acidification here in the Southern Salish Sea, and how is that impacting not only the shellfish industry, but also the full range of ecosystems and species here in the Salish Sea and off of the coast of Washington. And the short answer is it's affecting everything that has a shell or is trying to make a shell. Salmon, which eat small little zooplankton at various parts of their lives, are having a harder time finding the food they need, because those small animals that need to be able to make a shell are less abundant than they used to be. And of course, salmon, as Colleen mentioned, is one of the major food sources of orcas. So it's challenging all around. And I think that's where, you know, as we like circle back on the Salish Sea Hope Spot, it's such an important time for this, because it's drawing more attention on the need for partners and organizations, you know, across all boundaries, whether we're talking about discipline boundaries, territorial boundaries, international waters, to really work together to think about what solutions can we push forward, what has worked in one part of the Salish Sea, and how can we move that forward in other parts of the Salish Sea. And my hope for the Hope Spot is that it's going to draw attention and make some of those partnerships move forward more quickly than perhaps they would have otherwise.
I know, especially when you hear a lot of the stuff like that we've been talking about, it is hard because there's so much going on and you want to do something, but especially if you're not a scientist or marine biologist, it can be really difficult. So we actually had a question in the chat, I believe from Shane, and he asked a really good question. They said, are there ecotourism/citizen scientist programs in the area, whale watching, tours, diving, etc., that can contribute to your work?
Erin, I know the aquarium has some programs, but I do want to give a shout out to one of our Hope Spot partners, the PNW Protectors, which do have a citizen science kelp monitoring program, which as we talked about, these kelp forests are really important to baby juvenile salmon, so they can grow up and become orca food. So it's a really good way to kind of monitor what's going on with the kelp, and that also is an indicator of the general health of the Salish Sea. So I will grab a link for them, but that's one opportunity to do that. And then Erin, do you have other suggestions?
Oh my gosh, so many. So one of the great things about being in this place in the Pacific Northwest is that there are so many different community science organizations that are operating around in our area, both here in Washington up north and up north into British Columbia. I'm happy to say that Reef Check, which those of you who are in California or even in Oregon now and other parts all around the world might know the organization called Reef Check. They're expanding north. So they will soon be pulling forward and training divers to get out underwater and do kelp forest monitoring. So if you're a diver, keep an eye out for Reef Check. There's also an organization that's been operating for a long time here in Washington waters, and that is Reef. REEF, all caps. And they also work with community divers to get people underwater and monitoring what's happening with our kelp forest species. And then there are so many more organizations, it's hard for me to list them all, but that monitor everything from intertidal animals down to looking and doing bird watching and also strandings, monitoring strandings out along our coastline as well. And the aquarium, we have a community science project, but we work directly with high schools around in the Salish Sea to do monitoring and other research projects with students across several schools inside and outside of coastal protected areas in Washington. So if you want to hear more about that, maybe shoot me an email or check it out on our website. And I'll drop the link in the chat too, in case you or somebody you know is in one of the high schools where we run that program.
Well, I know another major question, especially if you're not necessarily in the Pacific Northwest, at least myself, I'm out here in Boston, Massachusetts, is what's an action that I can take from here? Do you have some other stuff that you can go into of stuff that we can do to help?
Yeah, we could put up our call to action list of things. And definitely I invite Erin and Shannon to weigh in too. But I would say, especially if you are not in the Pacific Northwest and still want to get involved, check out all of the websites for our organizations, plus our partners, and follow us all on the social medias, because we do post action alerts and opportunities to get involved and reach out to policymakers or elected officials. And even though the orcas and salmon are very local to the Northwest, they are a beloved and iconic species, definitely throughout the US and even throughout the world, especially going back to Tahlequah's story. She got worldwide attention and people around the world were interested and connected and just felt, very deeply moved by her story a few years ago. And her having a healthy new calf is definitely some good news and a reason for hope to share with all of those people who were following her story, and very, indicative of the way that this population has touched hearts and connected with people around the world. So no matter where you are, you have the opportunity to speak up for them and weigh in on policy decisions and just let people know that that you want this population to be around for the next, hundreds of thousands of years. It is still Orca Month, so you can visit orcamonth.com/actions, where we have a whole list of different actions you can take remotely from your computer, or making personal changes in your everyday life to help the general health of watersheds and the ocean and our planet. And each of our organizations as well, WC, the Aquarium, and Mission Blue, have lists on our websites for those personal changes that you can make at home. And then again, continuing to share the story of the Southern residents, talk about them with your friends and family, what they mean to you, why they're endangered, just sharing that information and getting more people involved and invested in the recovery of this population can go a long way towards helping them recover.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I would just add, we have, when we're ready, we'll play our special message from Dr. Sylvia Earle, but no matter who you are, where you are, where you live, there's always things that you can do. And so I think it starts with taking a look at your personal choices, your daily choices that you make. What kind of means do you use to travel? What's your carbon footprint? Do you eat a plant-based diet, or can you transition to more of a plant-based diet? All those things, what we purchase, the materials that our purchases are made out of, there's so many things that we can really do regardless of where we are, and look at. So I encourage everybody to look at their day-to-day actions, see where they can make changes that are, positive for the environment as a whole, positive for their carbon footprint. And there are lots of changes when you really start diving in and taking a look at this. And some of them are harder than others, obviously. But, for me personally, I eat a plant-based diet because it's the best thing that you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. And B, specifically talking about the orcas, if the orcas need salmon to live, I don't need salmon to live. I can choose other things. So that's just me personally. But I'd love to hear as well what Erin thinks.
The one thing I would say I would add, or just picking up on the theme of what we've talked about over the course of this webinar, is that we're all connected. All of us, every single living animal on this planet is connected to one another. And every animal in the ocean, it's one world ocean, it's all connected. And so no matter where you are on the planet, as both Colleen and Shannon have said, you are connected to the Salish Sea. And so the actions that you can take and the choices you make in your personal day-to-day, how you live your own personal ocean ethic can have a positive or a negative impact on the world. And we hope that, everybody listening in today or watching this later will lean into that and think about how you personally are connected to the ocean, whether, you are living on it, working on it, playing on it, eating from it, or maybe you live far, far away from the ocean, but you're still breathing the oxygen coming from the ocean. Up to 80% of the oxygen in the air comes from the ocean. So no matter where you are and how far you are from the ocean, you're benefiting from the ocean being healthy. So just encouraging everybody to take a look at your daily lives and think about ways that you can lean into your connections and ways that you can give back to the ocean. And that can be small things from, as Shannon was saying, thinking about how you purchase what you purchase, to thinking about how you get from place to place. And using your voice, because your voice can be very powerful in your local government and reaching out to your local government officials or at whatever level of government you feel comfortable. And you can visit any of our websites for more information about how to get involved if you're in one of the places where our organizations are based. Or I don't want to speak for everybody, maybe I can. You could probably reach out to any of us directly if you want to have talk about how you can get more directly involved or how you can take action. But if every single one of us works together and takes action in our daily lives and lives up to our own personal ocean ethic, the ocean will continue to be healthy. It will continue to, help our planet be a resilient place for generations to come.
And I would just add to that Dr. Sylvia Earle always says that one person can't do everything, but everyone can do something. And with that, if you guys are okay, I'd love to play the special message from Dr. Earl.
Welcome to the Salish Sea webinar with a special celebration of resident orcas and orcas everywhere. This is actually June, the month when orcas are celebrated globally. I'm Sylvia Earle, and for me, orcas should be celebrated throughout the whole year, which of course many of us do. Orcas really don't care whether we're celebrating them or not. But if they had their say, they would probably wish us to do exactly what those associated with this webinar are doing. Show them respect. Treat them with dignity. Just let them be themselves and understand that we share the same little place in the universe that is unique in all of the universe, Earth, dominated by the place that orcas know better than we do, the ocean. So I really look forward to hearing your deliberations, your thoughts about what can be done for the Salish Sea to enhance protection and for those who reside there with orcas as a symbol of hope. And so are you who are gathered to think about what the nature of the ocean is now for orcas and for us, and what we can do going forward to make it a better, safer place for all of life on Earth. Thank you for being a part of the action.
That's so amazing, Shannon. I don't know if you wanted to say something to follow up with that, but that's very, very awesome that we got a message from Her Deepness on Orca Month and the importance of the Salish Sea as a hope spot.
Yeah, Sylvia wishes she could be here with us in person. Obviously, her schedule is incredibly busy, but she wanted to say hi to everybody, thank everybody for joining the webinar, thank everybody for doing what they're doing, and we're excited to dive in a little bit more as we get further down into this Salish Sea Hope Spot. So just, follow all the channels, follow us on social media, and stay tuned on ways that you can be involved and things that you can do as we kind of evolve and expand.
Yes, on that, thank you everyone who joined us on your lunch hour today. Stay cool, be careful. We do still have 2.5 days of Orca Month left, so make sure to go to orcamonth.com. We do still have a couple more events, so it's not over yet. And then we are sharing daily stories about the orcas, so make sure to check those out there. If you were inspired by Tahlequah's story, learn a little bit more about the other individuals in the population. And then make sure to follow Mission Blue and the Seattle Aquarium and WDC in addition to Orca Month. And again, thank you everybody for joining, and have a good rest of your day.